Right, thank you all for coming on this remarkably sunny day, given the weather that we've had. And I was very keen to put Florence in front of a IISS audience for a few reasons. Firstly, I bumped into her in our Manama office in the Gulf just after she'd come back from her last research trip to Libya. And I thought the discussion we had was both analytically very focused and revealing, but also empirically very rich. So I thought that this would be a good person to put in front of you. Secondly, much to my frustration, and I suspect to Florence's as well, after the initial success of regime change in Libya, the press coverage has been moved from Libya to Syria, Egypt, and latterly Iraq again, for very good reasons, but it means what we get are headline news, bad luck stories. The murder of foreign workers, or indeed the temporary kidnapping of the Prime Minister or the resignation of the Oil Minister, and no long-term analytical focus. So from that point of view, we're very lucky to have Florence Garb with us. She is a senior analyst at the EU Institute for Security Studies, where she heads up the Middle East and North Africa program. And 9 months previous to that, she was deputy director of the NATO Defense College's Middle East faculty in Rome. A very good Arabist. Her linguistic skills puts me to shame, certainly. And I think she's got a very good range across the region with more than just Libya. Libya is her current research interest. So if you wanted to broaden out the questioning afterwards, you're more than welcome. Florence will speak for about half an hour, and then we've got half an hour for questions after this. And we'll end fairly sharply at 2, because I know you've all got desks to get back to. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, this is switched on. Good afternoon. Thank you, Toby, for your kind words. It's a pleasure for me to be here, especially because I understand that you are a very security-interested crowd, and as an Arabist, I always struggle with finding the right audience, because most people interested in the Arab world actually don't look at it from a security angle. That's one of my specialities, as Toby just hinted at. I have essentially 2 areas of focus when I look at the Arab world: is post-conflict, so security sectors under stress, if you want, and the other is military forces in general. So Arab military forces, that is. I've worked particularly on Lebanon, also on the Iraqi armed forces, and then I turned to Libya. And the reason I called this the failed fairy tale, the failed fairy tale, is because, as you probably all remember, originally the situation looked like this. In October 2011, all was well in the state of Libya, so to speak. Prime Minister David Cameron came to Tripoli, said, actually I quote here, the fact that roads are full of traffic, your water is flowing, your hospitals are working, this is impressive. Few weeks later, Libya was formally declared liberated. NATO ended its mission. End of story, at least end of the fairy tale. First time the United Nations issued a mandate for a mission to protect civilians. You had this massive popular move for democracy, human rights, etc., etc. You know the story. And unfortunately, the next thing that happened was this. This picture is from November last year. So not 2 months ago, 3 months ago, in Benghazi, where militias clashed with civilians, leading to about 40 dead. It's not an isolated incident. If you haven't followed the news on Libya the way I do, let me give you a brief update what has happened since the beautiful picture you saw just before. There is, the security sector completely imploded, regular attacks on actually foreign missions, not just the American mission. The tragic death of US Ambassador Stevens was actually just one in a series of events, attacks on UK missions, consulate and embassy, other European missions, the Tunisians, the Red Cross. I mean, everyone is a target right now, the EU delegation as well, but it's not targeting foreign dignitaries solely, it targets virtually everyone. Prime Minister was kidnapped. You have actually lately, last week, the son of the Interior Minister was kidnapped, etc., etc. More tragically, this also has an economic impact, and this is where it starts to hurt. One of the reasons Libya was a rather hopeful case of regime change was that people were thinking that Libya has these vast resources, which it does, of course, to rebuild the country. Unfortunately, in order to make money out of these oil resources, you need a certain security condition. You don't have that right now. We have a 70% decrease in oil output for a country that relies for its national income about 80% on oil. That's quite dramatic. So the situation in Libya is dramatic. We don't get. I think that the media is not paying enough attention to what is in the making right now, a disaster that's not in the making, that's actually already underway. The question is, can we still turn things around? Now, the question for me as an analyst is not so much what has happened, but why has it happened? What happened between the first picture you saw and the second? Why isn't there the peaceful transition to democracy that the NTC chairman, Mustafa Abdel Jalil, promised in October 2011? And I have identified three main reasons for that. Two of them were not avoidable in my opinion. One of them, however, was, and I'll try to be as policy recommendable as I can, because I know that that's the thing that interests you most. Now, the first reason is post-conflict and post-regime challenges that come in every country with certain aspects. I'll go into detail in a second. The second aspect is that the country has a certain political legacy, maybe that we have underestimated before, right after the regime fell. And the third reason is, in my opinion, a seriously mishandled transition, in particular by the Libyan authorities, but also by outsiders, including Europe. Now, regime change and post-conflict, be careful not to mingle the two. They are often related, but each of them is a significant challenge. When you take them together, it's a very bad situation by default. Now, the first thing that happens in a regime change situation, post-regime change situation, be it after a coup d'etat, a revolution, even a conquest by another country, is you have a certain institutional implosion. You have usually the upper levels of bureaucracy that don't come back to work, that can't come back to work, so you lose massive amounts of expertise. I was just at the FCO this morning, and some people told me that some of the problems that the UK has had in implementing projects with Libya is partly a bureaucratic hurdle, that there isn't the counterpart in Libya there that could actually absorb the offers that are on the table. So that's a serious problem, brain drain, loss of expertise, etc. That's not Libya specific, that would happen in any case, but it's something we have to keep in mind. Now, what's interesting in the case of Libya, the quote by David Cameron I mentioned in the beginning is that, of course, initially governmental services seemed to continue to run. They did run, actually, but as soon as the political reprisals began, people stopped showing up to work because they were afraid that they would get physically harmed, they would be harassed, imprisoned, what have you. So the real implosion of services in Libya actually began a few months after the regime fell. And that's why it's so interesting from an analytical point of view to not misjudge the immediate aftermath of the liberation of Tripoli. So regime change in itself is quite a difficult task. Now, if you add war to the equation, of course, it gets even trickier. Why? Of course, war has a certain cost, an actual cost, a military cost. It also has a cost of, let's say, not benefit, lack of opportunity for economic activity. So civilians usually can't go to work, can't pursue their economic activity when there is a conflict going on. So you have two dimensions of cost, actual cost and absence of opportunity to make money. So what does that mean in practice? Libya has lost 60% during 2011. It's still catching up. And as you've seen from the previous slide, economically it's actually kind of dwindling. Not helped by the fact that it's overestimated in its budgetary planning. In 2012, it had overspent already by June its budget for 2012. So because of lack of expertise, etc., there's been also some outcomes at the budgetary level, simply because people don't know how to do it, lack of expertise. Now, I'll jump this part. The point is that that aspect, in my opinion, was not avoidable. Nobody could avoid the fact that we are in a post-regime, post-conflict situation. And to give you just one more point, of course, security sector completely out of control. I'll get back to the security aspect in a second. It's particularly bad in Libya, but it's also a regular feature after a conflict that you have large amounts of weapons, large amounts of combatants, usually because of the institutional implosion, also a lack of oversight in the relevant ministries and parliaments, etc., etc. So last but not least, something that's been often overlooked in the European media is the fact that Libya has had casualties. 30,000 Libyans have died, 50,000 are wounded, several thousand still missing. There is an economic cost, not to sound heartless, but if the breadwinner of the family disappears, dies, there is a serious economic distress on the family that depends financially. So a severe situation in Libya, and one picture to just illustrate the case in point. Although it was a comparatively short war, it was still very much a ground war for the Libyans, and it has serious damage has incurred as a result. Now, the second point that I think led to the situation we have today is the legacy of the previous regime. And I'm sorry, just to add this up, post-regime, post-conflict, always trigger multiple crises in all kinds of societal areas. So by default, it was going to be difficult. Libya or any other case would have encountered the similar challenges. Now, the thing that I think we've overestimated is the legacy of the previous regime. There is this notion that Libya had no state, that essentially it was Gaddafi and his tent in the desert, and that therefore it was terra nullius. You know, we can build institutions from zero. That is, in my opinion, a serious misreading of what was going on for 4 decades in Libya under Gaddafi. The system that he created, I can't go into detail here, but the system that he created aimed at maximum participation of civilians. So created committees and congresses, one, so to speak, the legislative branch, the other executive branch, in brackets because it didn't apply to all of the areas. It was also not as efficient as he wanted it to be. Hence, he created these repressive revolutionary committees, etc. So I'm not promoting the Jamahiriya concept, but I'm saying that participatory politics, the idea that you have a basic congress, a regional congress, a national congress, where every Libyan can go, express himself, herself, participate in politics, it very much echoes through the system we have today. In other words, you have a Swiss model in a situation of extreme crisis, and that model only works if you have efficient decision-making structures, and you don't have that in Libya right now, and I'll explain why. Now, the other aspect is, of course, political parties were banned. Why are political parties relevant in some political systems? They translate group demands to a higher level. If you don't have, above a certain size, sheer size of society, you don't have political parties that can translate these demands, it will be difficult to liaise between the government and the people. So that's usually what political parties do. They were banned not by Gaddafi, actually by his predecessor, King Idris, in 1953. So we're looking today at Libya, a country that has zero experience with political parties. So very strong participatory politics, meaning caucus democracy, committees, congresses. It's almost ironic that the first thing the Libyans did after the committee system fell was create more committees and congresses. The General National Congress is actually, in my opinion, a direct replica of the previous system. Not in terms of its repression, etc., but yes, that system is still very much there. Now, what does this mean for today? Preference for flat hierarchies, a preference for consensual decision-making in caucuses all across the board, distrust for political parties. What was the last point? And of course, the inability to translate interest. What I said, what political parties usually do, they translate interests. There is nobody there right now who can translate interests. As a last point, and I'll go back to that when I talk about security, the fact that in Libya under Gaddafi, security, those who hold the keys to security use it to repress those who are their enemies. And that is also very much in place right now, and I come back to that in a second. So the fact that you have this echo, you can actually see it in the current political system. It's a transitional system, by the way. It's a transitional parliament. Of the 200 members of the General National Congress, it's predefined that 120 are supposed to be independents. 80 are elected on a party ticket. And even the parties, the two biggest parties, the Muslim Brotherhood offshoot and the NTC offshoot, are not as cohesive as, say, political parties or even other parties in North Africa. They don't have that groupthink that would allow them to translate interests at a high level. So the GNC, I mean, parliaments in general are talk shops. The GNC is even worse. There's loads and loads of discussion and very inefficient decision making. That actually also echoes through the Prime Minister's lack of authority. He and his government are not allowed to be members of the GNC. That in itself is actually not as extraordinary. That's the case in many democratic systems. But he has no clout whatsoever. He has no influence. He has no constituency in the GNC. Some people say the only reason he became Prime Minister is precisely because nobody in the GNC distrusted him enough to rally other people behind him. So, and tragically, his lack of clout also translated into his kidnapping in October last year. So in practice, so I explained earlier the context, so the situation full of crises. You have a system which is not very efficient, which doesn't take the decisions or can't implement the decisions that it's taking. And what are these decisions? And this is actually the third part that I think went tragically wrong. I think this aspect, the echo of the Jamahiriya, I think that many Europeans underestimated it. There was certainly also the idea that Libyans should find a new system for themselves, but in a lot of ways, I think that was not avoidable. This is such a long history that has remained with the Libyans. I'm not sure if they were, as quickly as they tried to move, able to actually move beyond 4 decades of a political system. Now, the mistakes that were made or the mishandling of the transition. As you know, there have been 2 governments since the end of the Gaddafi regime, the NTC transitional government, and then an elected one, and they have failed in particularly one area, and that is security. What did the situation look like in October 2011? Essentially, the official regime forces had melted away. This is a picture from a police station I took in Tripoli in 2012. All of them look like that. They've been ransacked. Police officers, those who have originally showed up to work, were harassed, were taken hostage, prisoners, what have you, sometimes lynched by militias. So in other words, they have basically disappeared. What did the NTC do, the National Transitional Council? They thought, it's a good idea. We already have plenty of men on the streets with weapons. They can take care of security. And that's in fact rather tragic. Order number 20 in October 2011 declared the creation of a Supreme Security Committee. Again, hint at the previous system. The first thing we do, we create a committee when we have a problem. So the Supreme Security Committee, the SSC, was supposed to draft 100,000 men into a provisional security force. All of them from militias, nobody from the previous system. Now, you already have a security sector that is difficult because abundance of arms, you had open prisons by the Gaddafi regime, et cetera, et cetera. You give these men who were already not trained, because the militias were civilians who took up weapons essentially in 2011, had no experience to fight a war. They also have no experience in how to manage civilian security. In other words, crime prevention, border management, law enforcement, management of prisons. All of this, what regular internal security forces do, were given to militias, to actually these young men that I've also met in 2012 when I was there. Lack of experience, huge task, even for another regularly trained security force, and no oversight. Remember, regime change, there was no oversight whatsoever. The Ministry of Interior was completely understaffed, there was chaos. So what happens when you give a large group of young people with weapons, a lot of power, and nobody there to control them? That has to go wrong, essentially. And the SSC actually became a problem fairly quickly. They are said to be involved in the destruction of the Sufi shrines in 2012, which led to the resignation of the interior minister. By the way, Libya has had, I think, 3 interior ministers since it was liberated, and I think 2 or 3 defense ministers. So there's also constant fluctuation in the key area, which is not helping. Siege of government ministries in March 2013. You might have heard of it, that led to, they forced the GNC to enact a law, which is, I'll come back to that in a second, is more draconian than de-Baathification in terms of excluding people who were tied to the previous regime. Clash with civilians, arbitrary arrests, torture, attacks on Western embassies, etc., etc. So the problem is that the SSC was actually not alone. There were plenty of other militias who started popping up. Some of them started popping up after the fall of Tripoli. So not everyone in Libya who's a militia today has fought in the war. I would say at least half, if not more, but there are many others who have formed after. For instance, these gentlemen are from the Libya Shield. The Libya Shield decided that it wanted to be an army in waiting. It rallied a few militias together, nominally was part of the Ministry of Defense structure. In practice, there was no oversight as well, and they are the ones who clashed with the civilians in Benghazi in November last year. They don't want to be part of the army, they want to be the army. And I come back to that in a second. So it's a really security mess. The other militias, you might have heard of the Zintan militia that used to manage the airport. They're holding Saif al-Islam al-Gaddafi in their prison. Prisons today are run, by the way, by militias in Libya. We guess that at least 5,000 people are held without any trial, any procedures that would warrant that. The problem is that the militias served into the current situation on their moral credentials, that they liberated Libya, which they did. The problem is that afterwards, a certain culture of impunity was installed, which gave them the feeling that they were above the law because they are legally above the law. First of all, there were one-off payments for everyone who had fought in the revolution, between $2,000 and $3,000, depending if you're married or not. The other thing was that in May 2012, the NTC issued a law, 38, which granted immunity, let me quote, to former rebel fighters for acts committed during the civil war, including murder, forced displacement, seizure, detention, interrogation of detainees outside a legal framework, anything that was in the sense of the revolution, that was any acts perpetrated in the sense of the revolution to achieve the revolution's goal has been declared above the law, so to speak. Now, what happened, initially the militias were not as politically savior as they are today. They really were trying to manage security. The longer they did that, the more empowered they became, the more emboldened they became, turning them into the problem that they are today. Again, not all of them, but yes, some of them are not serious troublemakers. And the Libyans themselves, the civilians, have started demonstrating on several occasions, hence the clashes, the picture I showed you, because they say the militias have to be disarmed. And the government has actually declared it wants to disarm them, but it doesn't have the muscle to do that. So we are in a chicken and egg situation. Now, one of the problems was that there was serious unrealistic planning on the NTC's side and the successive government. The first interior minister suggested that 50,000 of these militias should be integrated in the new security sector. Now, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with security sector reform, especially with integration of former militias, but that's actually quite a big number. That was unrealistic because first it ignored what the militias wanted as individuals, what they wanted as a collective, and what did the security sector actually want, and that's why it hasn't materialized. Now, the first problem here is that the issue of timing. I said the militias of today are not those that we had in 2011. Today we have empowered groups that are making political demands. In 2011, there was a window of opportunity that was missed. That's just a fact. The second fact is that the security sector itself did not want to absorb as many people. And I said, what did the militias want actually? And the Warrior Affairs Commission, which is a body created to manage the militias, did a huge survey amongst those who registered as former militia fighters or militia fighters, and 250,000 registered. Of the 250,000, how many do you think said, yes, I want to join the armed forces? 5,000. The others either want to take a grant, a government grant to open their own shop, work in a ministry, a clerk job, nobody wants to sweat in the desert if you can have a nice job in Tripoli. That's the first aspect. The second aspect is that those militias that want to integrate the security sector, they want to do so en bloc. Like the Libya Shield I showed you earlier, they don't want to be broken up and scattered all across the armed forces. They want to either be the armed forces or be a whole brigade in the armed forces, but they will not be dismantled and scattered all over the military institution. Lastly, the people I spoke with at what's left of the Libyan armed forces, they don't want to take in more than 5,000 people. The people there want to rebuild a new armed force, internal force, in the most professional possible way. And they say we cannot take in people that have problems with the command structure, that have problems with discipline, etc., etc., etc. Also, in a new security sector, you need to have a balance between old and new. If you take in as many as 50,000, that's actually almost all Libya needs in terms of security. Now, what is actually left of the security sector? It's also a bit in flux. Originally, well, police, as I said, was the worst. Most of them didn't come back to work. Of the armed forces, about 5,000 colonels came back to work. Why colonels? Because Gaddafi stopped recruiting officers, younger officers, several years ago, and until a few years ago, most officers were not allowed to rank higher than colonel because of Gaddafi himself. That was suspended a few years ago, but still you have a large bulk of colonels, which is actually not so bad. It's something that you can work with. But now the political isolation law foresees that any officer who has commanded a unit has to leave the armed forces. That doesn't take into account what level that officer was at the time. Is it an officer or an NCO? Was it involved in combat? Was it involved in the Chad, for instance, which arguably has nothing to do with Libya internally? None of this is taken into account. So this is why I said this law is much more draconian than de-Baathification, in the sense that it will really, in terms of collective punishment, will hemorrhage, especially the security sector that is rather failing. Last summer, the Minister of Interior declared that 17,000 people are officially part of the Libyan security sector. I would say that's probably a very optimistic guess. That doesn't mean that all of them are trained properly. It doesn't mean that they show up to work properly. There's a huge problem with absenteeism. But this sector is so small, it is very difficult for them to actually overpower the militias that are just much, much bigger. And lastly, the NTC itself refused in-country help from the very beginning. Not even a small UN mission in-country, I mean a military observer mission. They didn't want, and until now, they also don't want in-country training by outsiders, be it from Europe or other regional powers. So that makes the reconstruction of the security sector much more difficult, and it also has led to a downward spiraling in terms of security. Now, to end on a more constructive note, I'm sorry, that's actually not the constructive slide. To sum this point up, you had an already difficult situation that the Libyans haven't necessarily created themselves. You had a mechanism that was already ill-equipped to manage, and then you had a series of flawed decisions, particularly those relevant to the security sector and the militias. Still, to be constructive, what can we do at this point? Of course, I think the fact that the GNC and the executive, the government actually don't have the necessary procedures to enforce their decisions, that can still be changed. The Constitution is about to be written. You can still change that very flat, very participatory system and create a somewhat more streamlined one. I think that's something we can push for. The other aspect is it's not too late for DDR. We can still engage in a dialogue. The Libyans, the Warrior Affairs Commission, which I think is a very instrumental body, can still engage with the militias, find out what is it that these young men need. By the way, women are excluded from these programs. That helps them go back to a civilian life, or if indeed they want to have a job in the security sector, then they have to play the game according to the rules. Lastly, support the national dialogue that's just been launched. You might have heard that the UN has helped the Libyans who have officially declared a state of alert a few weeks ago, that a national dialogue is necessary to bring these polarized elements of society together. So it's not it's supposed to run for 6 months. It's supposed to bring together people from all kinds of Libyan walks of life, NGOs, civil society representatives, politicians, etc., etc. It is something that is desperately needed. All things considered, Libya is not yet a lost cause, but it's definitely not the fairy tale that we hoped it was going to be, and that we're running out of time to turn things around. And I'll end on that note.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I thank Florence for a very detailed and wide-ranging talk and for coming in exactly on half an hour. And as is indicated of the IISS's integrated approach, in your current edition of Survival, Florence has a longer piece called A Libyan Recipe for Disaster. So you get to read her after you've seen her talk. Now, we have at least half an hour for questions. If you stick your hands up, I will catch your eye and you say who you are and then ask a question and wait for the microphone to come to the gentleman there in the third row with the green jacket.
Thank you very much. Peter Asprey, I'm a member of the Institute. You mentioned that foreigners, foreign embassies, foreign representatives, so on, were targets at the moment. Can you say anything more about the nature of the threat? Is the threat political or is it criminal? Are there any common kind of threads running through that particular aspect? And can you say anything sort of in general terms about the feasibility of travelling in country at the moment if you're a foreigner going to have a look or trying to speak to somebody? Thank you.
The danger right now is that it's a very volatile situation in security terms. So you have some very structured, targeted organizations. You have, for instance, a killing spree right now, deliberately killing security officials, from the previous regime. To me, that points at an organized body that is doing the intelligence work required to identify these people and establish patterns of behavior, etc. We discussed this with Toby last night. I haven't figured out who that is, but it definitely points to me to an organization that's, as I said, organized enough to do something like that. I think their intention is to destabilize the country. Then, of course, there's the rumor of Al-Qaeda. I think Al-Qaeda, if anything, is in the south. It's not yet in the northern, in the cities, in Benghazi, Misrata, and Tripoli. Maybe it will come there. That it's hard to tell. But the organizations that are creating havoc right now are a bit all across the board, and not all of them actually have an interest in something in particular. So the attack on the Red Cross, for instance, had definitely an Islamist background, because they were, in the letter they said that the Red Cross is proselytizing Christianity, which is obviously not only not true, but also points at an Islam, not let's say Islamist, but let's say radical background. The other more dangerous threat, especially if you intend to travel, is that violence can erupt at a completely random time pretty much anywhere, because militias clash with civilians, with other militias, with governmental forces, and if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, you just happen to get caught. And that's much more difficult as a threat to evaluate, in terms of traveling, because you don't really know where it will happen. The Libyans themselves don't really know where it will happen. Sometimes it's as simple as a Libyan with a nice car drives up to a checkpoint and they tell him that this car is no longer his, and that can lead later to an eruption if this person is personally well connected. If you intend to travel, I would strongly suggest you don't travel beyond Tripoli. I would suggest that you stay in the city, or I would also not advise to go to Benghazi right now, and pick a hotel, not the Corinthia, because you know the Prime Minister was kidnapped actually at the Corinthia, which was supposedly the safest place. Pick a hotel that's not very exposed, and find a driver that others have recommended to you, and use the same driver every day. That's how I do it, but it's, as a Westerner, you might be a target, you might also just be at the wrong place at the wrong time.
Right, yes, you sir.
David Comley, a student at King's College London. First of all, thank you very much for a really interesting talk. I learnt a hell of a lot today. You ended on saying, so what can we do now, or what can the Libyan government do now? And you mentioned that relaunching GDR was a possibility. just thinking back over other DDR programs that have happened, it's usually relatively easy to do the first two Ds, to disarm and demobilize, but it's very, very difficult to do the reintegration part. Now, considering the state that the Libyan bureaucracy is in the government at the moment, and the fact that there has been a lot of resistance to outside help, presumably including experts who have learnt the lessons of previous DDR programs, what chance do you think this has of working, and what problems could they face?
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that, because at the Warrior Affairs Commission they told me in Libya we don't need DDR, we need DDI, integration, because those who actually joined the militias in the first place, they're coming from a place where they can't go back to. They were never integrated in that sense. These are people that need to virtually start from zero, with an education, with a formation, with a vocational training, etc., etc. But the problem is that the context that you actually mentioned, the wider context, not just bureaucracy, but Libya in general. It's a rentier economy. If of the 250,000, I think 70% or 65% want to have a government grant to open their own shop, what are they going to do? How many internet cafes do we need? I mean, these are people who often don't have an education, and this is against a backdrop where Libya's economy relies mostly on importing goods from Tunisia, from Egypt. I mean, in Tripoli, I ate yogurt from Saudi Arabia and drank orange juice from Austria, of all places. So it's a very import-based economy. The rest is produced with oil, and there's a bit of a social attitude to expect the state to fund the citizens. So absolutely, you're raising a valid point, and I didn't get the feeling that the Warrior Affairs Commission was very sure what to do about the fact that so many of them want to essentially open their own business, but what kind of business? And if you want to diversify Libyan economy, which Libya has to do sooner rather than later, maybe that's a good moment to actually channel these young men who want to do something with their lives. But the problem is that those who actually had a life to go back to, they often have demobilized spontaneously. So of the 250,000, I think you had about 30% that were over 28, were married and had a job, and they're already back home. So you are left with those that have no place to go back to, and that's why they're also more difficult. And that's why, of course, if you're 18 years old, suddenly you mean something. If you're in a militia, you have a gun, the girls think you're great, you do nothing but drinking coffee and smoking all day. Of course, I'd rather do that too, rather than working. No, don't quote me on that, actually. But the point is that they have something that's good for them. You have to offer them something that's equally good, or maybe better. And that's where the Warrior Affairs Commission hasn't been so successful. So there is, in a wider context, there still is potential. Work with the World Bank in particular, work with European, not donors, because money is not the main problem in Libya, it's really expertise, to find out a program that's maybe a bit more tailored to the Libyan needs. Bureaucracy, absolute fair point. The Warrior Affairs Commission itself is small. It tries to work hard, but it cannot make up for the fact that the other ministries have essentially imploded and were already not super efficient to begin with, and then have now lost a lot of expertise. It's not all lost, but you're right to point out that it's an extremely difficult situation. Now, lastly, I'd like to add that Lebanon has tried to assist Libya quite a lot. Lebanon is an interesting case because it has obviously a civil war experience, a much longer civil war than Libya, but its DDR program was, first of all, not as successful as many people think. It did integrate 5,000 militias, Lebanon that is, into the armed forces, but there was virtually no reintegration in Lebanon. People just went back to their to the social networks that would absorb them automatically. So in that, it's not surprising that Lebanon cannot really assist Libya because it doesn't have that experience itself.
The gentleman in the pinstripe suit on the front row.
Thank you. Nicholas Shredman of the IISS. Actually, I have a follow-up question on the R of DDR. We've had the quite a lot of contact here with the Colombian Reintegration Agency, and they've put through about 11,000, 12,000 people so far through their program. And one thing that comes across very strongly when you talk to them is the difficulty of reintegration, because societal attitudes towards fighters who've given up are so strongly anti. So I'm wondering, what is the situation in Libya? I can imagine on the one hand there would be quite a lot of gratitude towards the militias for having delivered them, but then blame for what's happened subsequently. Is there a societal attitude? Is it possible to characterize it? Are there militias and militias?
Yeah, thank you for giving me the exit, actually, to my answer. Yes, there are militias and militias. In the beginning, all over Tripoli, you would find posters for every martyr that had died during the war, with a picture of the person and painted on walls and all of that. It was actually quite interesting to see through how much effort people went. And when I asked them, well, who's paying these things? Is it the families? It wasn't even clear who did that. So it was partly an individual effort, partly communal effort, maybe the government as well. I'm not sure, but yes, there was a huge wave of gratitude towards the militias. That has evolved. As you say, there are militias and militias. Some militias are more accepted in the areas where they're from. And actually, that's also where the behavior has been less, let's say, causing trouble. For instance, you find that in Benghazi and in Misrata, where you have militias that are locally raised, they're still part of their family, there's a bit of checks and balances, not to misbehave, not to drink alcohol and go completely crazy. Unfortunately, the Zintan militia, Zintan is in the west, they managed a lot of Tripoli. So they were far away from home. They were not in their own neighborhoods. So that actually removed a bit of the social checks on them, and that led to abuse. So in some parts, you'll find there still is gratitude. I think overall, everyone agrees that they are not supposed to be a political force, that they have to disarm and go home, and then maybe you'll find another way of recognizing their contribution to the regime change than them having a political force. But in some places you'll find very strong anti-militia sentiment that leads to violent clashes, actually. So civilians that are taking up weapons against against militias. So that's a downward spiral. So that's why I said that there are some militias that formed after 2011. Some militias that formed in a neighborhood where suddenly you know that you're being managed by a group of young men from a city 200 kilometers away. You don't trust them. Okay, we're going to organize a neighborhood watch. Weapons and ammunition are not a problem, so you just start organizing the men of the neighborhood, and then you have a new militia. This is how it proliferates, so that's a problem. But they're not all equal, yes.
Right, let's start grouping the questions. Firstly, the gentleman on the second row, and then there's two questions at the back after that.
Thank you. Andreas Binke, University of Reading. Let's do a little bit political theory. This sounds like a Hobbesian war of all against all, which then, of course, leads to the conundrum, how do you get from that to a position where the sovereign asserts the monopoly of violence and the monopoly of power? It seems to me that this is very difficult because the mutual trust that presupposes is, as you just said, very much absent. So practically, it requires quite a bit of muscle to force these rather than convince them to give up their weapons. Who's going to do this in the absence of Libyan capabilities to do so? Is there a role for foreign muscle, so to speak, to come in and do this for them? Unless there is some form of coercion for them to give this up. I don't really foresee this happening. You mentioned economic incentives. Well, they can just grab them. They got the guns to do so.
And the gentleman there on the back.
Clive Soley, House of Lords and Good Governance Foundation. I have a colleague working there on political parties at the moment, and you're right on that. It's difficult. What I want to ask you echoes the last question in a sense. It seems to me that unless there's external power of some type, I'm not sure how you deal with the splintering in the police and the army. It is almost impossible to deal with as it is, and I would like your views on that.
And then the lady in the corner there.
Thank you very much. Ines von Weitershausen, LSE. My point is actually also on the role of external powers, but rather than on what they ought to do, could you maybe briefly comment on what is being done in particular by European powers at the moment? Thank you.
Excellent. So 3 questions astutely picked to be all on the same subject. The external muscle.
The external
plausible,
weapon, yeah.
and what are the external powers doing now, and can that be expanded?
To take them in the order they were asked, security has its own almost physical laws, I would say. As you said, there is actually no a security vacuum in itself is not natural. It will always be filled right away with something. In the case of Libya, the political theory that you hinted, yes, it's absolutely a Hobbesian situation. Unless we have the time to wait who's going to be the strongest of all the forces in country, which I think most people in Europe don't want to wait that long, we'll have to come up with what you said yourself and what the second speaker actually said, maybe outside help. Now, as a political scientist, I don't recall a case where you had an absolute implosion of security institutions, and then you had a state could rebuild its security institution without someone else filling the security vacuum. I think maybe Israel, but Israel built up its underground security bodies while the UK was there. So even there, it doesn't really apply. It's just, in my opinion, frankly, not feasible to rebuild your security sector while havoc is being wreaked outside. So you need a security blanket to create the conditions for security. It's a bit of a perpetuating cycle. So yes, it's evident that you need someone to force them, unless you find a large societal consensus that discredits the militias to the point where they have to give up. I don't see that happening, because in contrast to Lebanon, where the militias were actually linked to a certain societal group, let's say Lebanon 1991, where the Christians largely decide, okay, we don't want the civil war anymore. The Phalangists were discredited, and the end of the story, Sami Jaja was put in jail, and they were disarmed more or less forcefully by another semi-Christian body, the Lebanese army. You don't have that situation because the militias are not tied. That's what many people don't understand. They're not tribal militias. They are completely random sometimes. They're neighborhood militias. They have a very city identity, sometimes a bit of a tribal identity, so they're not connected to a societal group, and therefore you're right, the societal incentive is not there, the economic incentive is not really there. The external question, you might remember that in 2011 there was a lot of hesitancy, is that the word, to engage in Libya. Everyone remembered the Iraq, the Afghanistan scenario. Nobody wanted to have Western forces on the ground in Libya, let alone the Libyans didn't want that. But the Libyans wanted nobody. They didn't want the United Nations, they didn't want NATO, they didn't want other Arab states there, they didn't want Turkey. So how do you deal with that in a delicate situation where, as a European decision maker, you're arguing respect for sovereignty, for this young emerging sovereignty, and then the next thing you do under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, against their will, you give them an external force to enforce security. So I understand why at the time that didn't really fly. The problem is now it becomes more and more pressing, and you might know that the French Chief of Staff actually has said last week actually that maybe at least in the south there should be an international force to make sure that uncontrolled spaces there don't become a breeding ground for terrorism and organized networks, criminal networks, etc. The French government immediately retracted afterwards, saying that he had spoken only for himself. But I think that idea that maybe Libya is not able to manage it alone is gaining more and more ground. I think, unfortunately, we're at least 2 years late. I think it would have been much easier, much more cost-effective to do it right after the fall of Tripoli. If it's done, it has to be done absolutely delicately, taking into account the fact that there is a colonial history, so Italy is out of the window, there is the Iraq history, and there are so many people in this region with history, so it's going to be difficult to come up with the right force. But if the situation keeps going, yes, I'm afraid that's the only way out. What's being done by Europeans? For the time being, the UK, Italy, France, and to some extent Germany have offered help in the reconstruction of the security sector, and of course the EU has a border assistance mission. All of these are out of country. So in terms of efficiency, for those of you who are in the military yourself, you know that in terms of efficiency, it would make much more sense to have a small training mission in country, which could be much more efficient than flying, 1,000 Libyans to Jordan, as has happened actually in 2012, and that went horribly wrong because they ransacked the building, the Jordanians sent them back saying you should vet these people properly. So there was also that aspect. The Europeans are focusing in particular, depending on which ones you're talking about, the Germans are focusing a lot on police training, the EU on border assistance, the Italians on gendarmerie type, carabinieri, military police, so to speak, and UK, I think, very much on the armed forces reconstruction. The problem is that, in general, rebuilding a security sector from almost zero, it is ludicrous to think that that can be done under 5 to 10 years, especially if on the other side you have security imploding. There was already a problem in Iraq where at least you had, to some extent, a security blanket, an imperfect one, where you called back a larger amount of former Iraqi officers. You don't have the same situation in Libya. So in some ways, it's much worse. The help itself is good, but to train an officer takes 3 years. I think they're trying to speed it up to 1 year, but then you don't have the people who are as qualified, as trained as they should be in a situation of utmost crisis. So good things are being done. The problem is not money, the problem is time.
Okay, one final round of questions. You, sir, on the front row.
My name's Dan Smiley from The Economist. How strong do you think secessionist feeling is in Benghazi and the wider Cyrenaica? And tied to that question, how strong do you think the feelings are in places like Misrata for what I would call extreme autonomy? And I recall that only a few months ago you couldn't go into Misrata without permission of the main committees and militias. Thank you.
Anyone else? Yes, you, sir.
Thank you, David Richmond, a member of the Institute. Could you say a little bit more about the prospects for the national dialogue, what it might practically hope to achieve? Thank you very much.
And I'll take the liberty of asking the final question, and it's a very naughty one, but run with it if you can. There's a very you lay out, I think, absolutely accurately, a very pessimistic, fractured society, highly armed with a very weak state. Where will Libya be in 5 years against that background? So those are your three. The national dialogue, regional secessionism, and Libya's future.
Okay, yeah, the easy ones for the end. Secession. The interesting thing is that loads of people expected secession to become an issue much more prominently than it actually has become. Mostly it's been promoted under the term federalism, but federalism is enough to bring Tripolitanians up the wall because they see that as a first step to secession. You might or might not know that most of Libya's oil is located in the country's east, so Cyrenaica is also a region that has felt neglected under Gaddafi's regime, things that Tripoli was always advantaged by the regime. And not only in the east, there's also oil in the south, by the way. So there are these three regions, Fezzan, Cyrenaica, Tripolitania. For the time being, I see very strong local autonomy, a bit echoes what I said earlier about the Jamahiriya system, preference for local politics rather than anything national. I don't see that secession is an immediate problem. It might become a problem if the Cyrenaica believes that it really is easier for it to export oil, to be disconnected from the other parts of Libya. But so far, it has not been as prominent as many people think. The idea that a breakup of Libya is really what people want. Fezzan in the south is landlocked. It really needs to be in an alliance with either Cyrenaica or Tripolitania, so I don't see that as a secession. I think ultimately it will hold together. They have to figure out in the national dialogue whether federalism will actually appease some of these concerns, that the capital Tripoli overruled Benghazi. Misrata has evolved in a sociologically very interesting phenomenon because the experience of 2011 has emboldened the population. So there's a lot of talk about tribal identities, but Misrata has become a tribe in itself, if you want. The city has become a tribe in itself. So hence what you mentioned, the very strong, almost northern Italy in the Middle Ages sensation that the cities are actually running the show and not necessarily tribes or even regions. So I don't see secession happening anytime soon, but it's true that the word federalism is always used as a term to scare the West and to actually whip the West, Libya's West, into positions that it doesn't necessarily want to accept. The national dialogue, and so it relates a little bit to that, the national dialogue is supposed to address all the concerns that Libyans have today, and its task is to write a national charter which lays out the basic principles. So that's not a constitution, but if you want a document which assembles a certain societal consensus about where Libya is supposed to go. That will include the question of federalism, the division of power across the country, how the oil is managed, how the oil revenue is managed, etc., etc. As I said, there is this feeling by the East that it has been disadvantaged and so forth. But also the question of minorities, of Tuareg tribes, women is not really a main issue, but all these questions are on the table, the future of the militias, the government system. I mean, essentially whatever is a problem today will be discussed at the national dialogue. And again, the goal is for over the period of 6 months is to create a forum which then will create the conditions for a national charter. And I expect in this forum, there will be a lot of antagonistic moments of fights. That's the point. Maybe Libya should have started with a national dialogue and then go for elections and not the other way around. So where will Libya be in 5 years? I essentially foresee 3 scenarios. The one is that we continue with this protracted instability that doesn't bother Europe enough to intervene. So you'll find pockets of lawlessness, of crime across the country, but you'll also find pockets where things are going reasonably okay, in Tripoli, in Benghazi, in the cities essentially. That's not a really hopeful scenario. It's more of the same, but it's, as I said, not going to be enough to involve outsiders. The second thing I see is serious deterioration, which will call in either Europe or other forces to enforce security. I would actually say that depends very much on how the situation evolves this year. I think we will see the general direction for the next 5 years. You will probably be able to see throughout late 2014, depending on whether the national dialogue works, how the militias are going to position themselves, etc., etc. If that happens, I think that, of course, it would require huge involvement by whoever decides to go in. It will also be somewhat disruptive in North Africa. It would be, if you want, a surgical measure that will hurt some people in the vicinity, but maybe it's the only thing to do, depending on how security evolves. And lastly, maybe we have a Tunisian scenario. Maybe there is some hope left, and that's why I laid out these 3 points that can still be done. Where after a national dialogue, you actually realize we have to come together. This is the opportunity to reshape a country that has a lot going for itself. I would say that in the order of the way I just listed it, I would also say that's the likely and least likely. Likeliest, don't forget Libya has been on the descent for over 2 years. I've tried to raise interest for that over the last 2 years. In European capitals, there's a lot of focus on Egypt and Syria. Libya is not a priority. So for option 2 to happen, something worse has to happen. For option 3 to happen, something very good has to happen.
Excellent. I think that's a good way to end, and I think it's left to us to thank Florence for an excellent speech and a very incisive analysis. Thanks a lot.